I'd like to go ahead and introduce Jackson Katz. He is Dr. Jackson Katz, and he is an educator, author, and social theorist who is internationally renowned for his pioneering scholarship and activism on issues of gender, race, and violence. He has long been a major figure and thought leader in the growing movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. He is co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention, also known as MVP, one of the longest running and most widely influential gender violence prevention programs in North America. MVP introduced the bystander approach to sexual assault and relationship abuse to both of those fields. Katz is a key architect of this now broadly popular and adopted strategy. And he has run MVP strategies since its inception. I don't want to take up too much more time because I want Jackson to speak for himself. So now I'd love to invite you, Jackson, to please share with us whatever insights and thoughts you have that are bold.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And I want to say it's been a joy and a privilege over the years to work with you and David and your colleagues at Calcasa, and I'm honored to be part of your conversation today and your conference. And I also want to give a shout out to my old and good friend, Dr. Leah Aldridge, for all her leadership, Calcasa and elsewhere as well. These are obviously, and by the way, that was an incredible beginning keynote by Farah that I have to follow, but I'm gonna plunge in. This is an incredible time, the time of the pandemic, with the racial justice, protests and activism and uprisings, with a huge and consequential election just around the bend in a couple months. These are incredible times that do require bold moves. And I love the theme of the conference. And I love the fact that I'm part of a conference that is thinking out of the box, as well as thinking in more sort of ambitious terms about what needs to happen at this time. And it's all sort of happening and percolating, and the energy is clearly there for transformative change. And this conference is placed right in the center of that. And in the spirit of all that, in the spirit of participating in and contributing to that conversation, I have a few key points that I want to make. The first is, of course, something that I've been talking about and others have been talking about for a long time, which is that sexual assault is really a men's issue. Now, historically, it's been understood as a women's issue that good men help out with. But part of my work has been for a long time to try to sort of reframe the conversation and help to shift the paradigm of people's thinking about this. I don't see these issues as women's issues that good men help out with. That's part of the problem right there. Now, let me say, women's leadership, and obviously in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense here in the United States and all over the world, women's leadership over the past, half century really has been utterly, and longer, but certainly the last half century has been incredibly world changing. And I mean, on so many different levels around the issues of sexual assault and all the related issues. There's no doubt about women's leadership, but whether it's providing services to victims and survivors, holding offenders accountable, changing laws in that regard, or pushing social norms change around the acceptability of abuse and sexual violence. And to the extent that there is such a thing as prevention programming embedded in institutions, women's leadership has been utterly the center of all of that. And there have been men who have been part of that, but nowhere near the number of men that should be involved. And I think the fact of calling these issues women's issues is part of that problem. If we want to get more men involved, we have to start changing the language that we use to talk about the subject matter. Can I also say, one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have about women's advocacy and leadership in these areas is that they tend to think that women and girls have benefited, and perhaps gender non-binary folks and others, but men and boys not so much. This is completely mistaken, because men and boys have been profoundly affected in an extremely positive way by women's advocacy and leadership, whether it's acknowledging men as victims of sexual violence and the needs of men as survivors of sexual violence, all of which we're talking about in our culture today as a result of feminist women's leadership, who basically created the conversation and the paradigm to talk about victims and survivors and the need to shift resources towards victims and survivors, men have benefited so greatly from this. And the idea that somehow this work is anti-male is so ignorant on so many levels. And I think that one of the roles that men can play in this work is we can say some of these things out loud. We can say this is about us guys, both as perpetrators, but as victims, also in social and political economic positions of authority and power. We can say some of this stuff, and one effect of saying this stuff out loud is it takes some of the pressure off of the women who get criticized for being anti-male or male bashers, just for saying that we deserve, and all women and all men and everybody else deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. And let's not kid ourselves. The women who do take the stand on these matters do get a lot of incoming negative stuff still to this day in 21st century. And the more men who speak up and stand with those women, the more, the less that those women will have to take on their own, if you will. And it's the right thing to do as well. And obviously, another reason why it's a men's issue is that every man that I know has women and girls that we care about, has women and girls in our lives, in our families, in our intimate circles. I mean, give me a break. It's so obvious. And not only that, men who say they care about social justice, they care about fairness, they care about human rights. Why aren't those men involved directly in speaking out about sexual violence? We need to change. This needs to be part of the conversation going forward. Now, one piece of the shift that I'm talking about, the paradigm shift to think about these issues in a new way, is to think critically about the language that we use. And I'm just going to give you a handful of examples because I know some people know this and then other people are new to the work, and I think it's important to go over some basics. But I'm just going to give you a handful of examples of how we're currently using language that keeps us in the old paradigm, if you will. One of them is one of the ways we speak about and think about these subjects is by using passive voice and passive language. So we talk about how many women were raped in the United States last year rather than how many men raped women, or we talk about how many girls were sexually harassed in a school district rather than how many boys sexually harassed girls, or how many girls sexually harassed girls. We talk about how many teenage girls got pregnant last year in one state or another, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. And all this use of the passive voice has the effect of doing is shifting the focus off of the group with more power onto the group with less. And this is not a coincidence. It's not sloppy thinking. It's how power functions. And those of us who want to shift how power functions and make it more democratic, small d democratic, and more progressive, have to hold accountable power, if you will. And that's even in the very language that we use to talk about this. It's a political act to use active language. We have to make visible what has been rendered invisible by the language. Another example of this is even the term violence against women, which is a term that I don't like and I don't use, because violence against women is a bad thing that happens to women, but nobody's doing it to them. They're just experiencing it, kind of like the weather. But if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. And it doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate. And I don't think it's anti-male to be more accurate. I don't think fairness discriminates against men. I think it's just obvious, and we need to say it out loud. And then, of course, once we say it, we have to ask questions like, why is this? Why do so many men sexually assault and sexually harass or physically abuse or other ways mistreat women and girls? Is it genetic? I don't think so. But we have to talk about it, and part of the way of talking about it is just using honest and direct language, this passive voice. Another example of passive voice we talk about, and it's an important thing, all the violence against trans people or trans women of color, all the violence committed against them. There's no active agent in the sentence. It's bad violence that happens against them, but nobody's doing it to them. Let's just start being honest. Men are doing the violence. Again, I don't buy the fact that it's men inevitably because we're genetically predetermined or predestined to do it. I think that's BS. But if we don't even say who's doing it and talk about it, then how are we going to solve the problem? How are we going to actually enlist the sort of the individuals and institutions that we need to make the change that we have to make if we're not even willing to name it? By the way, another example of language is how often we use gendered language to talk about women as victims or survivors, and degendered language to talk about the perpetrators. So we'll say a woman was abused by her partner. So we're clear that it's a woman who's the victim or the survivor, but it's ambiguous who the perpetrator is, and it's overwhelmingly men, and it's yet another way that we're not saying what we need to say. Second point. I think these are men's issues, but in particular, one of the areas that I have focused on in my work in the last many years, really, but I think it needs to be more front and center in the movement, is we need to talk about men in social justice movements who are claiming to be committed to social justice, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, you know, men who are working towards, you know, combating whether it's income inequality or wealth inequality or even climate change, any number of social and progressive social issues. Men who are committed to that work need also to be committed to speaking out and working against sexism, misogyny in all its forms, and sexual violence. Not as an add-on, not as a special case, but because that's part of being a social justice activist. And if you're already committed to doing social justice change work, that needs to be part of your sort of agenda, both on a personal level and an institutional level. You know, one of the ways that the second wave of the modern women's movement was sparked in the late 1960s, early 1970s, was women's experience on the progressive side of the house, on the left, women of color, white women across the board who were experiencing, whether it's in the civil rights or racial justice movements or the anti-war movement and various other progressive social movements of that era, women who had been experiencing sexism on the part of men, that they were engaged in fighting against racism and these other larger systemic forces. Those women were experiencing sexism at the hands of the men who were their allies and comrades in the larger struggle. This is totally unacceptable 50 years later for there to be that going on. Now, I'm not saying that all men on the left or progressive men are the center of the problem. I'm just saying that that's got to be part of the conversation on this in the social justice movements, that these men have to understand that if you're committed to social justice, you're committed to feminist change, you're committed to anti-sexist activism on, like I said, on a personal level and on a political level. And I don't mean to make a false equivalence between men who are involved in social justice and men who are involved in more conservative or right-wing backlash movements who are trying to prevent democratization and prevent the challenges to the status quo. I don't mean to say that there's a false equivalence, although there are men in both on the right and the left who have personal stuff that they have to be held accountable for and that they have to get right. Let me just say that. I'm focusing particularly on men who are social justice activists and social justice committed, because that's what we're talking about in the sexual assault movement. We're talking about men who are committed to that kind of activism intersectionally. Now, along those lines, I want to read for you a poem by Eve Ensler, now known as the United States and globally. And this poem that Eve V wrote is called Over It. And I think I'm gonna use her words and talk to the men who are listening today and who are part of this work or who are hoping to be or thinking about how to be part of this work. It's called Over It, and I couldn't by any stretch of the imagination improve on Eve's words, so I'm gonna read them. This is just a section of this brilliant piece that she released in 2011. I am over the passivity of good men. Where the hell are you? You live with us, make love with us, father us, befriend us, brother us, get nurtured and eternally supported by us. So why aren't you standing with us? Why aren't you driven to the point of madness and action by the rape and humiliation of us? I am over years and years of being over rape and thinking about rape every day of my life since I was 5 years old, and getting sick from rape and depressed from rape and enraged by rape, and reading my insanely crowded inbox of horror stories every hour of every single day. I am over being polite about rape. It's been too long now. We have been too understanding. We need to occupy rape in every school, park, radio, TV station, household, office, factory, refugee camp, military base, back room, nightclub, alleyway, courtroom, UN office. We need people to truly try and imagine, once and for all, what it feels like to have your body splintered, your soul shattered. We need to let our rage and compassion connect us so we can change the paradigm of global rape. I hope men can hear this. I know that some men react to statements like that with defensiveness and like, I don't rape, or it's not my problem, or why are you coming on so strong? I appreciate that sometimes men react that way, just like sometimes white people react in the face of righteous anger and indignation on the part of people of color who are demanding to be treated with respect and dignity. Some white people recoil from that. I appreciate part of the challenge and part of the change process is moving beyond initial defensive reactions and absorbing what people are saying and hearing what they're saying and what they're experiencing, and then figuring out what can we do about this? What can I, with whatever subject position I have, whatever advantages I have in life, whether I'm white, whether I'm a man, whether I'm heterosexual, whatever it is that we have as a position, or they have money or resources in that way. If I live in the global north versus the global south, what can I do using the advantages and privileges that I've had to make life better and fairer and be responsive to the subordination and the oppression that so many people feel, like Eva Ensler just articulated in that, I think, powerful piece. One thing we have to do, as my third point, is we need to acknowledge what men are already doing. So in other words, we can talk prospectively about we need to engage more men, but I've been doing this work and my colleagues have been doing this work for a long time. And it's one of the things about, as the years go by, you think, oh my God, we've been saying some of this stuff for years and years. But we have been doing stuff. So we can't just say we need to get more men involved. We need to get more men speaking out. We've already been doing this. And there is an awful lot of men. There's a whole movement of men that started in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the pro-feminist men's movement it's multiracial, multi-ethnic, it's global. We need to scale up our work, however, because the number of men who are actively doing the work that needs to be done is a tiny percentage of the scope of the problem. It's nowhere near adequate to the scope of the problem. So we need a whole lot more men, but it's important to acknowledge that there have been men already doing work. And I want to shout out to one particular group of men. Look at what's happening, by the way, in the NBA, the WNBA as well, but the NBA and other male sports organizations. Look at how many male athletes, led by black male athletes, but also joined by white men who are athletes and athletic officials and administrators and league officials and such, who have spoken out about racial justice, who have helped to change the conversation. And it's like an incredibly transformative moment in sport being used as a platform for social justice activism, especially around police killing of unarmed black men and racial justice. And it's an incredible moment, right? But that didn't come out of nowhere either. There's a long history of men and women and others in the sports culture using sport as a launching point for social justice activism. And when I started the MVP program in the early 90s, my whole thinking was, how do we engage the sports culture as one institution in the society that has enormous influence in shaping norms for men, young men, and boys about, quote unquote, what it means to be a man? How can we engage them in a positive way? Imagine that if the number of men in sports culture who are now taking a stand about racial justice would join in taking a stand about gender justice and speaking out about sexual violence and using their platform of influence to do that. Imagine how incredible that would be. And by the way, the two are linked, because those of us in this work, and certainly Calcasa and certainly a whole bunch of people listening to this, know that you can't have a thoughtful conversation about racism without talking about sexism. You can't have a thoughtful conversation about sexism without talking about racism, and then intersecting other kinds of identities and oppressive structures. It's, it's the 21st century. We know a lot. We need to make these connections. So in other words, those NBA players and others who are speaking out about racism, in a sense, are also speaking out about sexism. And we need to make that even more explicit. We need to make it even more explicit and talk about revolutionary. And to Farah's, call to revolution, that would be revolutionary, wouldn't it? To have men, including white men, but also men of color, clearly, talking about not just racism, but sexism and systemic sexism and systemic misogyny and systemic rape culture, and not just systemic racism, but how they intersect and overlap with each other. It's all so incredibly important. Another point that I often talk about in my work, and I'll just kind of highlight it here, is we need to talk honestly about porn culture if we're going to talk about reducing sexual violence. We have an incredible problem in our society, that the level of brutality that is enshrined in normative heterosexual practice around the consumption of pornography, the normative abusive behavior that men are literally getting sexually stimulated by and getting pleasured by, the level of brutality and sexist sort of violence that men are doing to women in, quote unquote, heterosexual porn that has been normalized as normative heterosexual male behavior. We're kidding ourselves if we think we can talk about reducing sexual violence and not talk about that. I mean, really, how are you going to talk about consent and consent education, which is an incredibly important part of sexual assault prevention education, and not talk about the porn culture, which is presenting a narrative about sex and sexual engagement, especially heterosexual in this case, that is nothing at all about consent. It's about men doing something to women, and if they're not consenting, it doesn't really matter because ultimately they want it anyways. Think about how influential that is in the lives and psyches of millions and millions of boys and men in their private space. And then in the public realm, we talk about, well, we need to have consent, we need to have respect in sexual relations. But then in the private realm, they're literally immersed in an intimate act where consent is not at all part of the package. We need to talk about reciprocity and mutual pleasure and sexual engagement in multi directions, not just men doing something to women, which is the way that the porn culture, the heterosexual porn culture, frames heterosexual sexuality. We have very little sexuality education in the schools. We're clearly underserving our daughters and women and girls, clearly not meeting their needs by not having sexuality education. We're also not doing any favors to our sons and to boys and young men who are, to this day, we're in the 21st century, and to this day, the level of sex education and honest conversation about sexuality in the schools or in the educational spaces is embarrassingly low. And you know what? In the absence of public leadership and public educational engagement with that subject, guess what? The private market, in the name of the pornography industry, rushes into the void, and they give their version of what they consider, sexy, heterosexuality. And it's look at the results all around you. The damage all around is palpable and obvious. I also think that we need to understand these issues as leadership issues for men, and not just for women and others, but for men. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, if you're a man or a young man and you're either in a position of leadership or you're aspiring to be in a position of leadership, and I'm broadly defining that in your family, in your community, in your faith community, in schools, in the workplace. I mean, there's so many levels of leadership. If you're a man or a young man and you're in those positions or you aspire to them, you need to figure out what you can do within your sphere of influence to support victims and survivors, to hold offenders accountable, but even more so, to create a climate where the abuse doesn't take place in the first place. And by the way, you need to do this not because you're a nice guy helping out the women. That's the old paradigm. You need to do it because you're a leader, and we expect that of our leaders. If we can get to the place in the 21st century where men who are in positions of influence, as I'm talking about, know that this is what's expected of you. You're not a nice guy helping out. You're a leader, and you're expected to address these issues. The changes that that need to happen will happen much more quickly, because there's an awful lot of men, including a lot of really good men out there in the world, who have influence, who have power, who have authority in institutions, who don't see themselves as needing to be proactively leading on these issues. And they do. And I don't mean taking power away from women. I don't mean stepping on women and women's leadership. I don't believe that. I believe that they need to be learning from women and dialogue with women, to Farah's point earlier. Of course, it's not men going off and just, doing it on our own. I'm talking about, in dialogue, in movement, in conversation, in allyship and everything else. But there's so much more that men can be doing in positions of leadership. And if they're not doing it, I'm saying, and I think we need to say this over and over again, they're failing at their leadership. They're not failing at being a nice guy. They're failing at their leadership. And if we can build that into job descriptions for athletic directors, school principals, superintendents of school districts, political leaders at all levels, leaders of sports leagues, business leaders, and say, your job description, part of it is helping to create and sustain this climate and using the resources at hand to make the climate in your domain gender equal, and calling out abusive behavior and supporting victims and survivors. If you're not doing that, then you're not cutting it. You're not being a good leader in the 21st century. I think it would be an incredibly powerful development if we could understand that in this way. And again, one last point about that, and then I'm going to wrap it up. A 15-year-old boy whose friend tells a rape joke, who turns to his friend and says, "Hey, that's not funny. I don't appreciate jokes about rape. Could you joke about something else?" That 15-year-old boy has acted as a leader. He might not have any credentials that attest to the fact that he's a leader. He might not see himself as a leader, but that's a leadership act, because you know what? He saw a situation that was wrong, a joke perpetuating rape and lack of sensitivity to rape victims and everything else, and he said, I can't stand with I can't remain silent, and I'm going to say something, I'm going to do something, and he did something. That's executing a leadership protocol. So if you can define what I call bystander, which is another form of saying a friend, a teammate, a classmate, a colleague, a coworker, a family member. In other words, in this case, men, but it can be men, women, and people across the gender spectrum, gender and sexual spectrum. But if in this case, if you're a man or a young man and you speak up in the face of some kind of mistreatment around you, or even the attitudes and comments that lead to or help set the tone for abusive behavior, if you speak up in those settings, you're not being a goody-goody or a snitch or whatever word you want to use. You're being a leader. It's an act of leadership because you have the integrity to say that's wrong and I'm not going to remain silent. And by framing it aspirationally and positively, a lot of men can hear this message rather than say, you got to stop doing this, you got to stop. If we come in with the attitude of, come on guys, we need more men who have the courage and the strength to have some, commitment to putting into practice what we say we believe. This is very similar to what people of color have been saying to white people, including myself, for 40, 50, 150 years, which is, if you're a white person and you yourself don't see yourself as acting out in racist ways, but you don't speak up, you don't use whatever platform or privilege you have as a white person in this society or others, then in a sense, your silence is a form of consent and complicity in racism. And do you want to, is that the person you want to be? Or do you want to be the person who figures out, you know what, it's not easy, it's not comfortable, but I'm going to do something. I'm not going to be that person who's silent. Finally, and I appreciate your indulgence of my comments this morning.
Thank you, Jackson. Thank you so much, Jackson.
Can I just say one last thing? It'll be one sentence.
Quickly, Jackson. Thank you.
Sentences. If we want to make the bold moves that we have to make, there's an election in November. There's an election in November. If we say we're against sexual violence and we want to provide the leadership, and we need leadership that will commit to ending sexual violence and increasing gender equality, we have a clear choice in November. And the current occupant of the White House has undermined our work for the past 4 years. Let me just say that because I can say that as an individual. I'm not saying that as a member of an organization and I don't have to get funding from various sources. I can say what is the elephant in the room in this discussion. If we don't remove the individual who is currently in the White House, we can't say we really committed to ending sexual violence and increasing gender justice. So I urge people to think about all that's at stake in this election, and including being bold to move against sexual violence by how we choose to vote on November 3rd. Thank you very much, Sandra.